Welcome to IVF This, episode 116, The Ugly Truth of Overwhelm. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well today. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. And today I want to talk about overwhelm, which is everybody's favorite thing to talk about, right? It's relatable for sure. In fact, I ask each of my clients, what are the top 3 emotions that you experience on a regular basis? And without fail, almost everyone talks about overwhelm. That's the one that they notice most often. Maybe they'll mention anxiety too, or fear, or even one of the more positive or one of the more happy emotions. But overwhelm is almost always included in that list. So I feel like you're going to be able to relate to what I'm talking about. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about first before we get into overwhelm, because I think it's really important to understand that the overwhelm isn't just happening in a vacuum, right? So one of the biggest things that we need to talk about and we need to understand as it relates to IVF is grief. I believe that grief is a natural byproduct of IVF and infertility. Like, many people might not contextualize it in that way, but grief is an emotion that is the result of a thought you have around loss, okay? And in many ways, IVF is a loss of the expected course of how you thought your family planning journey would go. Number one, I don't like to make those sorts of assertions, but I think many of us hearing the doctor say, this is your best chance at having a baby, we're not really expecting that. Right? Some of us might, right? Maybe if you knew you had a pre-existing condition, you had kind of been bracing yourself along the way. But for a lot of us, hearing the doctor say, yes, I really do think you need to pursue IVF, it is your best chance at having a baby, that really, really does hit home. Whether it's male factor, female factor, or my mind went blank. Whether it's female or male factor or unknown, right? Whatever the reason or root cause is, for most of us, it takes us by surprise. And for a lot of us, even if we do have like a sneaking suspicion, that grief is still there, right? And so I think that when you understand that, and when you can kind of understand that there is a huge potential for experiencing that feeling of loss, even at the start, right? Before you've done the shots, before you've had a failed cycle or a failed transfer or a miscarriage, right? That loss is very real. So I believe, again, this is my belief, right? But I do believe that grief and understanding grief is an integral part of our healing throughout this journey. And the second thing that I want to acknowledge is what grief does to our brains, like physiologically, right? The physiological impacts of our grief. When we have had a loss, our system is overwhelmed, right? Our capacity to process information is, for many of us, can be diminished. It's like our brain is constantly buffering. And I don't mean like buffering in the way that I've talked about in the past or anything like that. What I mean is kind of that buffering symbol that you get when the computer's running slowly. Like, our brain is doing that, right? It's that spinning wheel of death. I get it all the time on Zoom calls. It's super annoying, but that's what I mean, right? That's what our brain is constantly doing. It's trying to connect all the dots, and it's taking forever. That's what I mean when I say our system is often overwhelmed in the face of grief, when grief has been introduced as one of the emotions that we're experiencing, right? So our brain can be overwhelmed, right? Our processing speed for information, for processing emotions, things like that can be diminished. Our ability to remember things, anything, can be compromised. Everything I talk about in the episode, the IVF fog, right? That's what we're talking about. That is what grief does to our brains. So, right, we might not be sleeping well. We might be swimming in all of the hormones of stress, right? I want you to think about cortisol and adrenaline. We all know that those are related to anxiety, but they are also a hormonal response in the face of grief, right? And so it's really important. This is just the reality of someone experiencing grief, a griever. Outside of IVF, this is true. Inside of the experience is also true. So I say all of that to say that I want you to give yourself some slack. Like, if ever there was a time in your life to show yourself the most just bathing in compassion for yourself, right now is the time, okay? We need to show ourselves compassion and understanding and just extend all of the grace that we can muster to our brains and our bodies. You know, that is what I'm talking about. That's what I always talk about, right? So there's the physiological process of grieving, which we just talked about. And what I'm going to focus on is the emotional aspect of grief that results in overwhelm. So understanding that there's not a whole hell of a lot of things that we can do around the physiological process of grief, okay? We can't do it. We can't stop the hormone dump. We can't do anything like that. But if overwhelm is our predominant emotion or a predominant emotion, that's what we can do something with, okay? And this is the type of overwhelm that might actually surprise you. What we're typically thinking causes the emotion of overwhelm. And that is that the circumstances of our lives have changed, right? Because that's true. The circumstances of our lives have changed. We had this fully expected, laid out course for how we were going to build our family, and that has been changed, okay? So we are pursuing the possibility of children via IVF. And I'm being very careful with my language here. The possibility, because that's what we're talking about. There is no certainty. And that is one of the biggest drivers for our overwhelm. Then you tack on things that we can't anticipate, like family functions, baby announcements, baby gender reveals or baby showers, other things or events, doctor's appointments where we might see pregnant people or people with babies, a ton of things that we cannot control and a lot of things that we can't anticipate, right? And the fact that IVF is such a logistically heavy process, when we understand that all of these things that we can't control, that means that things are coming at us and we're always constantly on the defensive for expecting to experience intense emotions. So maybe you're juggling a big work project and your doctor's appointments, or maybe well-intentioned people are asking you about your process and they maybe don't have a whole lot of background knowledge. So you feel like you're having to explain and go into depth about something maybe you don't really want to, right? And that's okay. Whatever your situation might be, what is important to remember is that we think that the circumstance, right? The circumstance is the reason that we feel overwhelmed, right? The logistics, the project, the family dysfunction, the not having the pregnancy or family planning journey that you expected, all of the elements associated with the IVF process. But that is what is problematic, albeit completely understandable, if you are new to the type of thought work that I do, right? So why is this type of thinking problematic? Oh, such a great question. I'm so glad you asked. The only way for us to get out of overwhelm is to deal with all of those things, to change all of those things. Some of those things might be in our control. The vast majority of them are not. The vast majority of those things are just facts of life, right? There are going to be people that get pregnant every single day. There are going to be people who announce getting pregnant every single day. So these are things we cannot change. So if the external circumstance is the thing that's causing our overwhelm, then we're going to feel overwhelmed all the time. And that's just not how it is. Now, I cannot overemphasize this enough. These things, right, our thoughts are the things that are creating our feelings, not the things around us. I don't teach that so that you will blame yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed. That's not the point. That's never the point. If I teach you that your thoughts cause your feelings, and now all of a sudden you're thinking it's your fault and you just need to think better thoughts and that there's something wrong with you, well, now you're blaming and shaming yourself, and we're headed in the very opposite direction of our intention, right? I tell my clients, all of my clients, the first rule of thought work is we don't use this against ourselves, right? The reason that I want you to know that your thoughts create or cause your feelings is that so you know where you can start, right? You see that you have options. You see how powerful you actually are. You can start to see the path to reducing the suffering and pain in your life. And you don't feel like you have to control the entire world or change all of the things to feel better, because that ultimately will not serve you anyway. So the real reason you're feeling overwhelmed when all of the things that are like this are happening is because of the way you are interpreting those things, because of the story you're telling yourself about those things, the thoughts that you're having about those things. So when we're thinking, I can't handle this, I'll never get everything done, it's too big, it's too much, I don't know if I'm doing it right, I don't know what I'll do if, right? Those interpretations of the things that are happening around us, some of which you can control, most of which you can't, that is the math. That is the neutral circumstance. If you've heard me say that before, this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? The think, feel, do cycle, the framework that I use for teaching and coaching all of my clients, there has to be a circumstance that creates the thought. And the circumstance is always neutral, okay? A common example that I see around this are pregnancy tests, like the pee on the stick times, right? We can feel very overwhelmed around the time that we suspect we might be pregnant, or around the time that we would have our beta blood test, or 14 days after we think that we ovulated, right? There are some people who begin testing early just to watch the line progression, and there are some that do not test at all until the blood test so that they specifically can be told yes or no, right? There's no right or wrong. No matter how you do it, it's not a problem, right? But I think that we can often feel overwhelmed because of the constant barrage of thoughts that we have running around tied to this idea of the pregnancy test, the result, right? A lot of the what ifs that we ask ourselves that do nothing but keep us locked into the what if game, right? So we're thinking about all of the what ifs. We're asking ourselves all of the unhelpful questions, which creates the feeling of overwhelm. And then one of the actions we take based on that feeling of overwhelm is to take the pregnancy test. And depending on the timing of the test versus when your beta is, or another test that your clinic might have you do, we can actually cause ourselves more harm, more pain, and more overwhelm. And this is what I tell everybody, the pregnancy test doesn't have any power over us. None. It doesn't get to decide for us how we want to think and feel about our lives, this cycle, or anything else. It is literally a stick. And not just a stick, it is a stick that you pee on, nonetheless, right? That tells you, the only thing that stick tells you is that if there is any measurable amount of HCG in your urine, that's the math. That's it, right? Is there HCG present in your urine? Then the pregnancy test is going to be positive. If there's not, it is going to be negative. That is the math. The results of the pee test are just that. They don't cause any emotions. And do you know how I know? Because for someone who does not want to get pregnant, seeing a negative result is a massive relief, right? Because they have different thoughts around the result of the pregnancy test. So if there can be more than one belief around this thing, or literally anything, then it is not a universal truth that a negative test will result in despair, sadness, grief, overwhelm, or anything like that. If there's more than one option, it's not math, it's a thought, and it's a feeling. That's just an example of how the human brain creates feelings with thoughts. It just is what it is. It's our brain, and it's unintentional, well-intended thinking that creates our emotional experience of anything, of everything. So I'm using the pee on a stick example, but I just want you to take a minute and think about where in your life, what area that right now you experience overwhelm when you think about it. Or maybe it's an overwhelm that happened yesterday or the day before or last week. What was that about? And can you separate the facts from the story that your brain is offering you? Now, again, we do this from a place of love and compassion, not shame, not blame. It's not helpful at all. And of course, our brain is going to tell us a story that we can't handle it, that it won't work, or it didn't work, or that it's too much, or that we didn't want to do it if we had a failed cycle or a failed transfer or a miscarriage, right? That's where we're out of our depth, that our brain is working against us. That's when we start to believe those things, that we'll never have the family that we feel we deserve or that we want in our hearts. Of course, our brain is going to offer us those thoughts. It's not even important that our brain stops offering us those thoughts as much as it is that we become aware of what our brain is offering us and that we start to see them as thoughts rather than just facts. Because when we see the sentences in our mind, what we can see is that the story our brain is telling us, and we can separate what exists objectively versus what we're making it mean, then we start to take our power back. We can almost start to go, oh, okay, I see the first response test or result can't overwhelm me. But the sentences in my brain that I believe are the only things that need to change, okay? If I'm willing to accept the pain will be a part of this process, if I'm willing to be compassionate and kind to myself throughout this process, that literally covers the two most challenging things around this entire experience. Being willing to accept that pain is part of the process and being willing to be compassionate towards yourself throughout the process. The two most painful areas. You start to think, when you can accept those, when you are willing to accept those, then you can start to think, I can handle this. Maybe it's possible I can allow a feeling of sadness or grief exist without piling on the BS about who I am as a person and what those feelings mean about me or my life. Maybe I do know what I want. I do know what to do next. Maybe I do know how to take care of myself regardless of the outcome. Maybe, if this is going into your first round, maybe you've been through multiple rounds, maybe you want to change doctors or clinics or whatever the situation may be. When you are willing to accept those two things, the whole process becomes easier. It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it becomes easier because you're not beating the crap out of yourself at every turn, okay? When we feel overwhelmed as humans, we don't really do a whole lot, right? We get stuck, we spin, we ruminate, we second guess, we procrastinate, we make plans and then we don't follow through because when we get to do it, we just feel overwhelmed. And as humans, we don't get to take productive action when overwhelm is the emotion that is fueling us. It's the classic catch-22. I've taught you about the negativity bias in our thinking. It's a whole episode that I did a couple of years ago. So we think the thought, I can't handle this. We feel overwhelmed. We don't start, or we start and we stop. And then our brain uses that as evidence that yeah, you're right. You can't handle these things. See, there's another thing you can't do. Oh, look over here. See all these other things you can't do? See all these other things you can't handle? And now we're really believing that we can't handle it. It seems so true. It's too much. I'll never get what I want. I have all of this evidence for it until we stop and we take a step back and we go, what's the math here? What's the math versus the drama that my brain is creating? Thank you very much. That's what it does, right? And then we make a conscious choice about how we want to think. And we choose our thoughts on purpose, knowing that our brain is going to offer us some ridiculous doozy of a thought that's never going to be helpful, but we're ready for it. I'm constantly on the lookout for what my brain says, something like, you don't have enough time. There's not enough time, right? My brain wants to tell me that all the time. You'll never get it all done. It's too big. It's too much, Em. You've bitten off more than you can chew. My brain loves telling me that. And I am still constantly having to redirect it, just like I would have to redirect a toddler, because that's basically what we're talking about. Your primitive brain, the part of your brain that comes up with all of this BS, is basically a toddler that is just throwing a constant temper tantrum. So I just need to be compassionate to myself. That's the thing. That's the first step. If you ever do anything with anything, if you ever hear anything from me, I want you to hear this. I just need to be compassionate to myself. It's okay, love. That's how I talk to myself. It's okay, love. You don't have to do it all. You're doing your best. It's okay. I got you. Let's get to the practicality of it. So we talked about overwhelm in the body and in the brain. We're not going to argue with it. It's just part of grief. We've talked about overwhelm as a feeling, which causes our thinking. That's where we want to focus our time and energy. So here's what we do. In that moment, we notice we're feeling that feeling and we give it a name. This is overwhelm. We don't try to resist it. We don't try to push it away. We just name it, claim it, allow it. It is not going to hurt you. It's not some sort of black hole that you're going to get sucked into or a cliff that you're going to fall off. It is a feeling. We've had feelings that are much more intense than this before, guaranteed. So name the feeling, name it, open up to it, witness it. That is the now process. I have a whole episode at the very beginning of this podcast, maybe it's the first 5 episodes, where it talks about feeling better now. Name it, open up to it, and witness it. Now, sometimes you'll notice that you have a really harsh inner critic. I want you to go back a few episodes. I did a whole episode on silencing the inner critic, and that's going to be really important. You can also get some coaching around it. I'm happy to help, but that's the idea. So there are a lot of things that are going to happen, but you want to notice it. You want to name it. You want to allow it. Remember, you want to remind yourself, you're not alone here. Overwhelm is not you. There's nothing wrong with you because you're experiencing or feeling overwhelm. Overwhelm is a human experience. I guarantee you, it's an emotion that almost everybody listening to this podcast has experienced, especially IVFers. There probably are a couple of people who maybe even haven't started IVF. Doesn't mean they've never experienced overwhelm. They are probably intimately familiar with it. So remind yourself you're not alone. It's not that no one understands you or that other people are further along in their lives or with their goals, or that you're the only one who doesn't have it together, the only one missing out on a family. It's not true, okay? Overwhelm is a shared experience for all of us. Doubt is a shared experience for all of us. So then you just want to get curious with yourself. Ask yourself, what's going on here? What am I thinking? What's causing this overwhelm? Because my brain wants to tell me it's the pregnancy test or the medication or the injections or the things that people say to me. My brain wants to tell me it's the process. It's everything that's outside of me. But it's not. That's not it. If it's my thoughts, what I'm thinking I can't handle this. This is too much. See if you can isolate it. Tell yourself the truth. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You can walk away from treatment. You can walk away from all of this. A lot of people do. That's not a problem. There's no right or wrong. The truth is that you don't want to yet. That's why you keep waking up every day, showing up, even when you feel like a hot mess. The truth is that you're choosing to act, to carry on, to deal with all of the things that come with an IVF cycle, to figure out how to do all of this stuff in service to your family, to navigate all of the emotions that you're feeling, to figure out how to take care of yourself, to love yourself throughout the process, regardless of the outcome. There were, and continue to be, many times that I have had to refocus my intentional thoughts towards myself. Sometimes it's as basic as like, I'm safe. This is temporary. I don't have to like this. That was one that I held on to pretty dearly through the IVF process. I didn't have to like it, but I decided I was going to do it. I was willing to go through the process. So that's what we did. Marie Forleo, she's a writer, and she came out with a book not too long ago, maybe within the last 5 or 6 years. So everything is figure outable. You're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. One foot in front of the other. I want you to talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend or someone that you loved and they're going through this. Because the reality is that we're going to think the thoughts that make us feel overwhelmed. And we just want to be prepared for that. You're not going to get to a point ever in your life where you no longer experience overwhelm. It is not going to happen. It's not realistic to hold yourself to that expectation. So we just want to be prepared for it when it does happen. Doesn't mean we've done anything wrong when it happens. It's just the way our brain works. It's not a problem. We want to be ready for it. We want to have a strategy. When it shows up, we know who we want to be in that moment. How we want to talk to ourselves without feeling this overwhelming feeling. How can we be our own cheerleader, our own ally, our best advocate, our own champion when that happens? Many of us notice that our brain wants to bring out the shame and the blame and the judgment and the compassion, and it's okay to do just that. But we want to make different choices that are more productive and more supportive to ourselves. Just because our brain offers us crap thoughts doesn't mean that we have to keep thinking them. We can decide what we want to think about so that we're supporting ourselves through all of this, providing some relief to ourselves through all of this. We have that ability. None of that external stuff has to change for us to be able to improve our emotional experience of it. So that's what I want for you, is less suffering. I want you to know how to support yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed. I want you to give yourself a break. Know that physiological changes might still be impacting you. God knows we pump ourselves full of hormones. That's okay. We're not going to argue with it. But we can control what thoughts we listen to in our brain and what thoughts we choose on purpose. And we can control our reaction to it. And we can control our reaction to our emotions so that we change the experience of what we're going through. And that is what I want for each and every one of you. Okay. That is what I have for you this week. Have an amazing week. Just love all over yourself. You are amazing. You're doing some really hard shit. I do this a lot with my clients. I know I was about to wrap up, but I got to say this. I do this a lot with my clients. When I notice that they're doing something well, I tell them. Do you know why? Because if we don't hear that we're doing well, or if we don't tell ourselves that we're doing well, we automatically believe that we're failing. just the way the human brain works. So I want you to tell yourself, bitch, you're doing a good job. Maybe you don't have to say it like that, but you're doing a great job. You're working hard. You're fighting. Even when you're resting, you're doing a great job. Okay, really, that is what I have for you this week. I hope you have an amazing week, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.